They always said the orchard slept through winter. But that morning the snow felt different. Too quiet. Like it was holding its breath. The kind of stillness you don't notice unless you've lived in it for years, unless you know what normal sounds like. And I did. Because that was the day I realized Sister Catherine and Sister Isabel weren't coming back. Before we start, hit subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury, and make sure no name stays forgotten. My name is Miriam Blackwell. I've lived most of my adult life at St. Agatha's Convent, a modest stone structure tucked into the foothills outside Mornington, Oregon. I was 54 when all this began. 32 of those years had been spent behind the convent's gates. We kept to simple routines, prayer study tending the gardens, making preserves in summer, herbal salves in winter. We were a quiet place, a forgotten place. The kind that doesn't make the news unless something burns down. There were 12 of us still living there by 1991, most older than me, some nearly too frail to kneel at evening mass. We knew each other's footsteps, each cough behind chapel walls, each page turned in the library. And we knew Catherine and Isabel. They weren't sisters by blood, but you wouldn't know it to see them together. Catherine was sharp, even fiery when she felt something was unjust. Isabel was the quieter one, always smoothing things over, always with a vial of lavender oil tucked into her apron pocket. She said it helped with headaches. I think it helped her breathe. On Wednesdays, they'd walk down to the village infirmary 2 miles each way, carrying whatever we had extra. Jam, dried herbs, sometimes a hot flask of tea. Everyone in Derry Glen knew them by name. That week it snowed early. Soft, dry flakes that settled across the garden paths like flour. Catherine and Isabel bundled up like always. Long coats, boots, polished habits pulled tight under woolen scarves. They left just after morning prayer. They never came back. At first we told ourselves it was the weather. Maybe they'd stayed in the village. Maybe the infirmary needed help overnight. But by Friday their beds were still made. The thermos of tea still sat on the kitchen counter, cold and untouched. And no one had seen them. Not the postmaster, not the grocer, not the constable. That morning Saturday I stood at my window in the east wing and watched the snow fall. It covered the courtyard statue of St. Francis. It dusted the cemetery stones like lace. And for the first time since I'd taken my vows, I felt afraid. Not of what had happened, but of what I might already know. When I finally turned from the window, the room felt smaller. I reached for my rosary, but the words didn't come. Only a knock at the door. Mother Agnes. Pale, tall, unreadable as always. She didn't step inside, just said softly. The constable found nothing. No sign of them. I nodded. I didn't know what else to do. And then she added, "They've wandered off before." I looked her in the eye. No. Catherine didn't wander. She hesitated. If this becomes something more, it must be handled with care. Then she left. And I sat there, hands trembling around a rosary that suddenly felt much heavier than it had the night before. That was the moment I knew something was terribly wrong, and that whatever it was, it had started a long time ago. I waited until late afternoon to go to their room. The others were still gathered in the common area, flipping half-heartedly through scripture, sipping lukewarm tea. No one was saying it out loud, but the silence in the halls had shifted. Every sound felt too loud, every absence louder. Catherine and Isabel's door was slightly ajar. I stood there for a moment with my hand resting on the wood, then pushed it open. Their room was just as they'd left it. 2 narrow beds, perfectly made rosaries looped neatly over each headboard. The air inside still held the faint scent of lavender oil. Isabel always dabbed it on her pillow to help with Catherine's headaches. Their Bible sat between them on the nightstand, bookmarked, and next to it a worn paperback of Tennyson's poetry pages curling at the edges. Catherine had dog-eared The Lady of Shalott. I sat down slowly on Isabel's bed. The mattress barely gave under my weight. For a moment, I just sat there, unsure what I was hoping to find. Then I felt something a crinkle beneath my palm, a folded slip of paper tucked under her pillow. The handwriting was familiar, tight and precise, but shaky. Catherine says we must speak to him again. I begged her not to. She believes forgiveness is still possible. I fear she's wrong. If something happens to us, please look in the orchard. Something should never have been buried. I read it twice. Then again. The orchard. I hadn't stepped foot back there in years, not since the last of the apple trees began to rot and the garden was officially declared closed. We'd fenced it off after the shed collapsed, but some of the older waymarkers still stood moss-covered and barely legible. I folded the note carefully and slid it into the sleeve of my habit. That evening after Compline, I waited until the others were asleep, slipped out the side gate by the old tool shed, keeping to the edges where the snow wasn't as deep. The orchard felt smaller than I remembered. The trees were brittle, hunched like old men limbs stripped bare. Wind pushed through the branches in slow, whistling sighs. I followed the edge for a while, my boots crunching over snow packed with ice. I didn't know what I was looking for until I saw it. A break in the snow near one of the trees. Subtle, easy to miss, but the ground beneath it had been disturbed. And not just by one person, there were overlapping footprints already starting to soften at the edges. I stepped carefully toward the tree. The bark had been scarred years ago by lightning left blackened and rough. At the base, the snow was pushed back the dirt, dark and heavy. Someone had been here. Recently. I reached up and pulled a ribbon from my veil, tying it loosely to the lowest branch above the spot. I couldn't dig then, not with the others still awake, not alone. But I would return. That night I barely slept. Isabel's note was still tucked in my sleeve, its corners worn soft from where my fingers kept finding it in the dark. At breakfast, no one spoke about the missing sisters, but their absence sat in the room like a third plate at every table. Sister Genevieve sat across from me. Youngest in the convent, barely 24, hair always escaping her veil. She glanced up from her bowl of oatmeal, hesitated, then said softly, "Do you think they left on purpose?" I asked. She nodded. "No," I said. "They would have told me." She looked down again, spoon unmoving. Later that morning, I went to the library. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't ask permission. Just walked the narrow aisles until I found the shelf marked Visitor Logs, 1970-1999. The records were old, ink-fading paper, yellowed at the edges. I pulled down the stack for 1989. I hadn't meant to go that far back, but something in that note, the orchard, the warning had stirred a memory I didn't want to name yet. That year, there were only a handful of entries. Parish visits, food deliveries. But one name appeared 4 times, all between March and October. Father Thomas Nolan. I froze. The name hit me like hearing a song from another room, something I hadn't thought about in years but recognized immediately. I flipped ahead. 1990. 1991. No more entries. Just those 4. And then nothing. A knock broke the quiet. Mother Agnes stood in the doorway. Her eyes flicked to the books in front of me. "I was told you skipped lauds." I was reading. She stepped inside, looking for something I didn't answer, just said Father Nolan. Her face didn't change, but her hands tightened at her sides. That name hasn't been spoken here in a long time. Catherine and Isabel spoke to him, didn't they? Agnes sighed. He was stationed here briefly, before your time, during the renovations at St. Bridget's. He helped in the orphanage wing. I felt something turn in my stomach. There was a girl, I said. Mora, wasn't it? She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. Did Catherine know? She wasn't here then? Agnes said. But yes, She found the records. I stood. She believed Nolan was involved. She believed justice had been delayed, Agnes said carefully. But she also believed in mercy. That's why she went looking. I stared at her. And you let her, Agnes stepped closer. Be careful what stones you turn over, sister. This convent has survived because of what we've left buried. Maybe it's time we stopped surviving, I said. Maybe it's time we started remembering. She didn't respond. That night I returned to the orchard with a small spade wrapped in cloth. The ribbon was still fluttering on the tree branch. I dug slowly, quietly. The soil was damp, not yet frozen, recent, and buried beneath it a wooden box, no bigger than a loaf of bread, old, rotted at the corners. Inside a stack of letters tied in string, 2 photographs, a broken rosary, a cloth pouch, and a cassette tape wrapped in tissue, labeled in faded ink, "Recording Do Not Destroy." I didn't have a player, but the infirmary did, and before the sun rose, I was listening to the voice of someone I hadn't heard in almost a year. Catherine. I don't know how much time we have left. Isabel wants to go to the bishop, but I don't trust that path anymore. Nolan came back. He knew. He knew Maura had written to us. He knew we had the files. He's watching. Always watching. There was a long pause. I believe Miriam will find this. I pray she does. If anything happens to us, go to the orchard, and then go to the police. Don't let the church bury this again. I sat there in the glow of the infirmary nightlight, the tape still spinning, and I knew exactly what I had to do. I waited until after morning prayers to speak with her. I thought maybe, just maybe, hearing Catherine's voice on that tape would be enough to move something in her. But when I stepped into her office, Mother Agnes didn't even flinch. She was already seated at her desk, hands folded like always, her cup of tea untouched. "You listened to them?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. Just looked at her. "You knew," I finally said. Catherine said you knew. She looked down, but not out of shame, more like resignation. "I knew parts," she said. "Rumors, fragments, things I chose not to see clearly." "You let him come back," I said. She nodded just once. "There are times," she said, "when silence feels like survival." It hung there between us. "And there are times," I said, "when silence becomes complicity." She didn't argue, just looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. I pulled the tapes from my pocket and set them on her desk. "I'm giving these to someone who will actually listen." Her eyes followed the tapes, but she didn't reach for them. "I'll testify," I said. "I'll tell everything I know, and I suggest you prepare to do the same." Agnes didn't speak as I left, and I didn't turn back. I reached out to Detective Carver the next morning. He'd been the lead on Maura Delaney's case back in '91, the case that went nowhere, the case that vanished as quickly as the girl had. His number still worked. When he answered, his voice was dry but alert. "This is Sister Miriam Blackwell," I said, "from St. Agatha's." A pause. "I've waited 30 years for this call," he said. "So have I." The following week, 2 cars pulled through the convent gate just after sunrise. Carver stepped out of the first. Gray, now heavier in the shoulders, but his posture hadn't changed. He looked at me like someone who'd carried a file around in his mind too long. "This where they were found?" he asked. I nodded and led him behind the tool shed through the narrow gate into the orchard. The blue ribbon I'd tied days earlier was still fluttering from the tree limb. His partner, Detective Boone, followed close behind. Younger, sharp-eyed, efficient. She carried a satchel and wore gloves. No small talk. "We've reviewed the box and the tapes," she said. "We brought a team to conduct a recovery." Quietly. I stepped back as the crew began digging beneath the marked tree. It didn't take long. The first body was found just before noon. wrapped in a worn wool blanket, twine across the chest, a small wooden crucifix placed just above the collarbone. Sister Isabel. Boone knelt beside the grave. "We'll confirm with dental," she said softly. "But you already know." "She would have never left without Catherine," I said. Less than an hour later, they found the second grave, 15 feet away. Same blanket, same twine, same care. Sister Catherine. The orchard had always been quiet, but now it felt still, as if the earth itself knew what it was giving back. Boone stood beside me, arms folded. "They weren't dumped," she said. "Whoever did this took time. Buried them with reverence." "It wasn't reverence," I said. "It was guilt." She didn't argue. Then one of the techs called out from the other side of the clearing. Something else. Deeper. The digging resumed. Slower this time, more cautious. By late afternoon, they'd unearthed a third skeleton, smaller. Bones delicate, partially fractured. The bracelet was still on the wrist, tarnished, but the name was still visible. Mora D. I didn't speak. I couldn't. Carver stepped beside me. He didn't say anything either. He didn't need to. That night the convent felt hollow. Not quieter, just emptied of something I hadn't realized I'd still been carrying. Mother Agnes sat in the common room, her hands curled tight around a cup of tea she hadn't sipped. She didn't look surprised when Carver and Boone entered. "I need to know what you knew Boone said." Agnes didn't answer right away. She looked toward the chapel window. "I knew there'd been a girl," she said. "Mora. I knew she went missing while Nolan was stationed here. I suspected. But I told myself it wasn't possible. And when Catherine came to you, she showed me files, records, asked me to help bring it to the diocese. I told her no. Why Carver asked. She looked at me when she answered. Because I was afraid, and because I knew what would happen to this place if the truth came out. The church would shut it down. We'd be scattered, forgotten." "You were afraid of losing bricks and wood," I said. "But you let lives be lost instead." "I regret it," she whispered. "Every day." Boone was steady. "You'll need to give a full statement. This is now a triple homicide investigation." Agnes only nodded. Later that evening, I walked the orchard alone. The bodies had been taken, but the ground where they'd rested still held weight. I knelt near the spot where Catherine had been buried. "I found her," I said softly. "I found Mora, and I found you." The wind moved through the trees like breath, and now I added, "They'll know everything." Back in my room, I lit a candle and opened my journal for the first time in decades. On the first blank page, I wrote one name, Mora Delaney. Then beneath it, "We are not ghosts in habits. We are the memory the church tried to silence, and we will not go quietly." I closed the book and placed the tapes back into the box. Then I sat down at the edge of my bed and waited, because I knew what came next. The bishop, the files, the retreat in Montana where Nolan had been sent. The truth was rising now, and there was no putting it back in the ground. After the bodies were taken and the orchard cleared, the convent went on pretending. Chores resumed. Prayers were said. A new candle lit each night, though no one said why. I didn't resume anything. I kept a small corner of my room for evidence: the box, the tapes, the photo of the three of us tucked between the pages of my journal. I opened it every night. Not to read, just to look. That photograph, Catherine with her arms crossed, Isabel smiling behind her, my own face, mid-laugh like I hadn't yet learned to hold it back, was the last real moment I remembered before everything changed. Detective Boone called 3 days after the recovery. "We've got the paperwork ready," she said, "and the bishop's agreed to meet. He wants to keep it quiet and dignified." I didn't answer right away. "Will you come with us?" "Yes," I said. "I have to." The diocesan office in West Oregon wasn't built for grief. It sat behind tall hedges with polished glass doors and a receptionist who wouldn't look at me when I gave my name. The waiting room was quiet, all hard chairs and muted carpet. Detective Carver sat to my left, leafing through a manila folder without reading it. Boone was on the other side of me, straight-backed hands clasped. When we were called in, the bishop was already seated. Alan Thorne. Impeccable as always, crisp collar, pressed sleeves, the kind of expression that reads polite, even when there's nothing behind it. "Sister Miriam," he said, as if I'd just returned from holiday. "It's been a long time." "Not long enough," I said. He glanced at the photos Boone laid out on the table, images of the box, the graves, the tapes. He didn't flinch. "I had no knowledge of these items," he said evenly. "But you knew about Nolan," Carver said. "You reassigned him more than once. You protected him." The bishop didn't blink. "There were rumors," he said. "No formal reports, no convictions." "You didn't look for convictions," I said. "You looked the other way." There was a pause. Thorne leaned back in his chair. "We protected the church. You protected a predator," I said. Boone's voice was low. "Where is he now?" The bishop hesitated for the first time. "He was removed from active ministry 10 years ago. He lives at a retreat facility in Montana. He's under supervision." Carver didn't even look up. "We'll need the address. You'll need a warrant." "We're not the ones hiding anymore," Boone said quietly. Back at the convent, I sat in the chapel until after midnight. I didn't pray, not really. I just sat with the box on my lap and the cassette player beside me. I played the last tape again, the one marked Final. "If you're hearing this," Catherine said, "then Isabel and I are probably gone. We tried. God help us, we tried. I begged her not to meet with him again. But she still believed in forgiveness. I believe in justice." Her voice had changed. There was no more fire in it, only fatigue. Mother Agnes knew. She knew and said nothing. I stopped the tape. I'd heard that line a dozen times. It didn't get easier. The chapel felt colder than usual. The stone floor beneath my feet colder still. I opened the box again, spread everything out, papers, photographs, rosary, the ribbon-wrapped twig cross that had belonged to Mora. It was all still there. All of it. And still part of me worried I'd imagined it, that I'd conjured a story from grief and silence. I'd lived here so long it was hard to remember where the world stopped and the church began. But the tape didn't lie. Neither did the soil. I didn't leave the convent much in those days. But one morning I walked down to the edge of the village, just to feel the air outside the gates. The townspeople had started to talk again. I passed 2 older men near the post office. One of them nodded. The other didn't. Down the street, the grocer was sweeping salt from the front steps. He glanced at my habit, then looked away. 30 years ago, they'd hung missing posters for Maura Delaney on every telephone pole. A week later, they'd taken them down. No one ever asked where she'd gone, just that she had. That night, I listened to one of the other tapes, Maura too. He said silence was holy. He said my bruises were my fault. I made him do it. The voice was young, but not small, not unsure. He locked me in the cellar. Catherine found me. She stayed until morning. I stopped the tape. My hands were shaking. I'd forgotten how tightly truth can hide behind language. I hadn't forgotten the cellar, but I hadn't allowed myself to remember it like that. The next day, I heard the front doors of the chapel open while I was refilling the candles. I turned and saw him. He was standing in the entryway, hat in hand, collar visible under a heavy coat. Father Nolan. His face was older, thinner, But the mouth was the same, that small, practiced curve that tried to look gentle. I didn't speak right away, just watched as he stepped down the aisle. I heard he said, "About Catherine, about Isabel." "Did you?" He nodded. "I came to offer comfort. Your comfort," I said, "is the last thing this place needs." We sat outside in the cloister garden. The snow had melted in patches, leaving muddy footprints across the stone. He kept his hands folded, calm, measured. "I think you're remembering things that were meant to stay forgotten," he said quietly. "I never forgot," I said. "I simply wasn't ready to speak." "You don't understand what's at stake." "No," I said. "You don't get to say that anymore." He tilted his head. "I saved her," he said. "You buried her." He said nothing. "I have the tapes," I said. "The photographs. Her bracelet, her voice." Now something flickered in his expression. Just for a second. "You don't have proof," he said. "I have enough." He stood then. "I always knew you were the difficult one," he said. "Catherine played the long game. She died trying to stop you," I said. "And Isabel, if she's still alive, I will find her." He walked away without another word. The snow started falling again, light at first, then thicker. I stood there alone in the garden, not shaking, not afraid, just angry. I didn't sleep the night he showed up. Nolan's voice still echoed in my ears long after he left. Not loud, just steady practiced. The kind of tone that cloaks itself in God's name when it needs to. The kind that's trained to sound harmless. But it was the silence after that unsettled me most. I sat at my desk, the box open in front of me. Everything was laid out exactly as I'd found it in the orchard, the letters, the photos, the broken rosary, the little cross made of twigs and ribbon. But there was one thing I hadn't looked at closely. Not really. A small cloth pouch tucked beneath the stack of papers. I remembered it tied with black string, the kind you'd see on old church vestments. I opened it carefully. Inside were 4 microcassette tapes, labeled in a neat, unfamiliar hand. Mora 1, Mora 2. Nolan Session 3C, Final. I had to hold them close to the lamp to read the labels. The ink had faded, but the dates were still there. Spring of 1991, a month before Mora disappeared. Back in the infirmary, I found the cassette player still sitting behind the supply cabinet. Dusty beige, missing its back panel. But it worked. I loaded the first tape. For a moment, just static. Then, he says, "If I tell, I'll go to hell. But I already feel like I'm there." A pause. He says, "My bruises are my fault. That I make him do it." It was her. Mora's voice, young, breathy, careful, like she was trying not to cry into the mic. "He touches me when no one's looking. I don't like it. I told Catherine. She said it wasn't my fault." I stopped the tape. Even after everything, hearing her voice like that, it felt like she was right there beside me. Still 13. Still waiting to be believed. I loaded the second tape. He locked me in the cellar. Said it was penance. Catherine found me crying. She held my hand until morning. There was a faint sound behind her voice. The hum of something, maybe a boiler, maybe her breath. I didn't think anyone would find me. I hit stop again. Not because I couldn't listen, but because I needed to. Slowly. Tape 3. Session 3C started with a different voice. Nolan, not shouting, just talking calm and controlled. "You act like I planned this." There was the sound of someone shifting. Then another voice. "Catherine, you're a coward. You heard her. You saw what he did, and you buried it. You will burn for what you've done." The tape cut out. It must have been a recording from one of their meetings. Not confession. not formal, but deliberate. There'd been more than one conversation, and they'd recorded it. I sat back in my chair, the player still running silent. The fourth tape. Final was wrapped in tissue paper, handwritten on the fold. Do not destroy. I rewound it to the beginning. Catherine again. If you find this, I fear we're already gone. I tried. God help me, I tried to fix this. I begged Isabel not to go back to him, but she still believed in forgiveness. Her voice wavered then. A breath caught. I believe in justice. There was a long pause, then a quieter sentence. Mother Agnes knew. My hands froze on the player. I rewound that part again. Slower. Mother Agnes knew. There was no mistaking it. She'd said it plainly, like it had become a fact she no longer had time to soften. That afternoon, I walked the tapes down to Agnes's office. I didn't call ahead. I didn't knock. She was seated at her desk again. Same window, same hands folded, like she hadn't moved since I last stood there. She looked at the tapes when I placed them in front of her. I'm giving these to Carver tomorrow, I said. She didn't reach for them. I'll testify, I added. And I think you should prepare to do the same. Agnes didn't argue. Not this time. What else do you want me to say? She asked. You let Maura down, I said. She didn't meet my eyes. I turned to leave but stopped at the door. Don't let Catherine and Isabel disappear into history too. This time her silence felt different. It didn't feel like distance. It felt like shame. Carver met me at the edge of the orchard the next morning. The forensics team had already cleared out. The graves were gone. The ribbons I'd tied had been bagged and labeled. He took the tapes from me carefully, then looked at the pouch. These are your originals. Yes, I said. I found them inside the confessional wall. He gave a small nod. We'll digitize everything. The DA will need them. Did you find anything else, I asked? Boone walked over, then holding a clipboard. One of the technicians flagged something odd in the soil depth beneath the third grave. Maura's, she nodded. We thought it was just debris stone or root, but it looks like there's more. More possibly. She didn't elaborate, but I could see the shift in her eyes, something she hadn't expected. Do you want to be there when we go back in? She asked. I nodded. I didn't say anything else. Because whatever they found next, I already knew it had been waiting. The forensic team came back early the next morning. The sky was clear, but the orchard still held that unsettled quiet, like the ground remembered what had been taken from it. They marked off a wider perimeter this time, not just around Catherine and Isabel's graves, or the shallow pit where Maura's body had rested, but beyond it. Toward the edge, where the apple trees thinned and the soil ran dark from winter runoff. Carver stood with his arms folded across his chest, watching the dig. Boone didn't say much. She just pointed once to the diagram the team had laid out, then walked the line herself. Back and forth, measuring distance, checking for symmetry. I stayed a few paces back. I didn't need to see everything up close. Not right away. But when the call came, one of the techs waving them over. I stepped closer. They'd uncovered something deeper, beneath Maura's grave. A wooden floorboard broken and rotted at one end. Not natural, flat, cut by hand. Boone crouched, brushed off the soil, and looked back at Carver. Substructure, she asked. Cellar, maybe, he said. Root storage. Too old for storm shelter. The team cleared more earth, planks, brick lining, and then a rusted iron hinge, an old trap door. It took two of them to lift it. The air that came out wasn't cold, just stale like a basement sealed off for decades. It smelled like dust and rain rot and something older. They dropped a work light through first, then climbed down. The space wasn't wide. 10 feet long, maybe 5 across. Braced walls, packed dirt floor. But someone had once used it. recently back then. A rusted cot frame, thin chain bolted to the corner, fabric scraps, a child's sweater torn down the front. I didn't speak. No one did for a long time. Back at the convent, I sat at my desk with the fourth tape, the one I hadn't finished before. Catherine's voice again. We went to him. We told him we had the files. We asked the church to open an inquiry. He laughed. A pause. Said no one would believe two nuns from a forgotten convent. Said we were just ghosts in habits. But we left a trail. Isabel insisted. We hid copies of everything. If he comes back... Miriam, you must not face him alone. The tape crackled. Then silence. I left the player running, but nothing more came. That evening, Boone called. They were headed to Montana, the retreat center. The judge had signed the warrant. She didn't ask if I wanted to come. She already knew the answer. We arrived the next day. The center sat up against the slope of the mountain. Gravel path. Pine trees crowding the edges. A stone building with shuttered windows and a copper bell tower that hadn't rung in years. It used to be a monastery. Now it looked more like a place the world had quietly let go of. Boone knocked once. Carver stood just behind her warrant in hand. The door opened. Father Nolan answered it himself. Older, shoulders hunched, skin pale under the collar he still wore even in hiding. He didn't look surprised. I figured it might come to this, he said. We're reopening a triple homicide, Boone told him. And possibly more, Carver added. Nolan stepped aside. There's tea, he said. You're welcome to sit. We didn't. His room was small, clean, a fireplace with a slow-burning log, shelves lined with religious texts and behavioral psychology manuals, some locked behind glass. Boone held up the warrant and opened the case. The cabinet held journals, labeled by year, handwritten. She started pulling them out one by one. 1989, 1990, 1991. She opened one, read silently for a moment, then flipped to a bookmarked page. June 1991. She read aloud. She came to me again. Catherine. Her eyes were full of judgment. They never understood Maura, her purity, her weakness. The orchard is still quiet, but it remembers. She turned another page. Isabel screamed, not at me, at the truth. I told her what Maura said, that she loved me, that she understood. But Isabel said I was twisted. She ran. I couldn't let her. Carver's voice was low. That's your confession. Nolan looked up slowly. I've already confessed to God. Boone's voice stayed even. Now you'll confess to the court. He didn't resist when they cuffed him, didn't ask for a lawyer, just stared at the trees as they walked him to the car. When they opened the back door, he paused. Will the church protect me? He asked. Boone didn't hesitate. No, she said. Not this time. We drove in silence for most of the return. I kept the last journal page open on my lap. There were other entries, dozens, some cryptic, others explicit. He'd written everything down, as if absolution could be earned with pen and paper. But there was one entry I kept going back to, scribbled at the top of a nearly blank page. Miriam was always the stubborn one. She stayed when the others looked away. She'll come back. I closed the journal and looked out the window. We were already back in Oregon. The orchard was waiting. And so was the truth. They brought him back in handcuffs, but even then he moved like a man still convinced he held the upper hand. When the car door opened outside the courthouse, Nolan stepped out slowly, scanning the crowd without flinching. He wasn't wearing the collar anymore, just a wrinkled suit and a tie that didn't quite match, but his eyes still searched the faces around him like they owed him something. Cameras flashed. Reporters called his name. But he kept walking silent, steady, flanked by officers on either side. I was already inside. Seated near the front, hands folded in my lap, a silver crucifix resting just beneath my collar. In my lap, a stack of handwritten notes. I hadn't decided whether I'd use them. The courtroom was full more people than I'd seen gathered in Mornington in years. Some were parishioners. Others were strangers who barely remembered Mora's name. And some were just quiet faces who looked like they'd carried this weight too, but never had the words for it. When they brought Nolan in, no one clapped, no one shouted. The silence wasn't for him. It was for what had been taken. The prosecution started methodically photos from the Orchard journal entries from Nolan's retreat audio clips from the tapes Catherine and Isabel had left behind. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. Mora's voice filled the courtroom first, a faint, shaking girl's voice on a grainy cassette. He says, "Silence is holy. He says my bruises are my fault." The room didn't move. Then Catherine's voice measured resolute her final words recorded before she vanished. "Don't let the church bury this again." They played the tape until the end. Some people turned away. Others didn't blink. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly, walked to the witness stand, and swore in. I didn't look at Nolan. I looked at the jury. 12 strangers who hadn't lived inside those walls, who hadn't heard a child cry in a chapel meant for prayer, who didn't know what it felt like to bury 2 sisters with nothing but a ribbon and hope. I told them what I knew, how Catherine and Isabel had come to me, how I hadn't listened, how they had uncovered records no one wanted found, transfers, medical reports, letters from the orphanage that had disappeared from diocesan files. I told them how we found the trap door beneath the orchard, how Mora's bracelet had still been wrapped around her wrist. I told them I'd failed her, that I'd spent years in silence believing I was protecting something holy, when all I was doing was giving cover to someone who used faith like a shield. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I just said what happened. When the prosecutor asked if I believed the church had known, I said yes. Not in writing, maybe, not in words, but in the way they moved him, from one parish to the next, from chapel to chapel, always away, never accountable. I turned toward the jury for one last sentence. "Believe the dead," I said, because they never stopped speaking. We just refused to listen. When I stepped down, no one spoke. Nolan's attorney declined to cross-examine. He didn't call any witnesses. Nolan didn't take the stand. When asked, he said only, "I've already faced judgment." The courtroom was still. Even God, it seemed, had nothing left to add. The jury was out for 3 hours. When they returned, the clerk read the verdicts one by one, guilty on every count. Kidnapping, abuse, murder, premeditated concealment of evidence. Nolan didn't flinch. He stood as if the weight of the words barely reached him. I didn't move either. I just breathed. Long and slow. It wasn't celebration. It wasn't relief. It was the sound of something long buried finally being exhaled. Outside, the reporters circled. Cameras angled for a shot. The church issued a statement. Apologies, acknowledgments, promises of accountability, but I didn't need to hear it. For once, the truth had been spoken in full. That night I returned to the chapel alone. I placed 3 candles on the altar, one for Mora, one for Isabel, one for Catherine. I lit them slowly. Not for mourning, for memory. 6 months later, the orchard bloomed early. The trees that had once hidden bodies now carried white blossoms that bent under the breeze. We cleared the last of the brush, repaired the fence, set a plaque in the center under a new tree we planted together. It read, "In memory of Sisters Catherine and Isabel and of Mora Delaney. They were not lost, they were silenced. Now we remember." I read the words aloud, my hand resting on the soil. Amy, one of the younger sisters, placed a wooden cross at the base. They should have had decades, she whispered. To live, to be known. They do now, I said. The convent had changed. Fewer sisters, more community work. The diocese had tried to close us, but the town pushed back. Instead, St. Agatha's became something else, a place where silence was no longer expected. I started a weekly meeting in the library. Testament hour, we called it. No robes, no hierarchy. Just women speaking. Some stories were light. Others came with long pauses and trembling hands. But none were hidden. One Sunday I took the coastal road. Drove out past Whitlow Cliff with a satchel on the seat beside me. Inside were the last of Mora's journal pages, ones found after the trial, tucked inside a hymnal at Nolan's retreat. Her handwriting was faint shaky in places, but one page had been rewritten 3 times, each word careful and clear. If someone finds this, tell them I tried. Tell them I forgave. But I couldn't survive him. Please don't forget me. That's all I ask. I read it once more, then folded it into a glass bottle, sealed the top, and walked to the edge of the bluff. The ocean moved like it always had, slow, strong, wide enough to carry anything. I whispered a prayer, half Latin, half breath, and let it go. Back at the convent that night, testament hour was full. I told the story from the beginning. Not the investigation, not the trial, just the girls. How Mora used to draw with the edge of her sleeve tucked into her hand. How Isabel always burned the toast. How Catherine once nearly left the order to be a teacher in Vermont. They were full of life, I said, and the world took it from them. But we give it back every time we say their names. The room was quiet after that. Then one by one the other women spoke. Names. Memories. Truths no one had dared say before. When I returned to my room, I took off my crucifix and set it gently on the desk. The sea wind moved through the open window, brushing the curtain like a hand. I whispered, Catherine, Isabel, Mora, you're home now. In the distance, the waves kept moving, not like a threat, but like a heartbeat. And I knew the story wasn't over, but the silence was. I still walk the orchard. Not every day, but often enough to know when the seasons shift. You can smell it before the leaves change something in the soil, in the bark, in the wind coming down from the hills. It's quieter now, not empty. Just quieter in a way that finally feels right. The kind of quiet that comes when there's nothing left to hide. They let us keep St. Agatha's. I don't know how long that'll last. Money runs thin even in sacred places, but for now it's ours. The gate stays open, the chapel stays warm, and the door to the old library never locks. Every Thursday evening we light 3 candles and speak their names. Mora, Isabel, Catherine. Sometimes the room is full, other times it's just me and Sister Amy folding prayer cards and waiting for the silence to settle. Father Nolan died 3 months into his sentence. Stroke, no appeal, no confession beyond what we already had. There were whispers that the church would keep it quiet, that his name might vanish from records or be buried under layers of red tape. But it didn't. The trial changed something. People spoke. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough that silence no longer felt safe for the ones in power. That was something. I've thought a lot about justice. What it is, what it isn't. For years I imagined it looked like punishment, like a gavel striking wood or a man in cuffs. But that's not what stays with you. What stays are the small things. The names written in Mora's journal. The sound of Catherine's voice on tape steady, even when she knew no one was listening. The way Isabel would hum under her breath when she thought no one was watching. Justice doesn't fix what's gone. It just gives the truth somewhere to land. Some nights I still wake early, not from fear but from habit. The kind of waking that comes from years of waiting for footsteps in the hall, for keys turning in locks, for someone not coming home. And when it happens, I make tea. I sit by the window. I let the dark hour pass. And when the sky begins to pale, I whisper their names again. Not out of grief, out of reverence. There's a stone at the edge of the orchard now. Flat smooth, no gold or flourish. Just 3 names, and beneath them, we are not forgotten. I didn't write the words. They came from a girl who never got the chance to grow old, who trusted the wrong man, and whose truth was nearly buried with her. But they're right. They're what I want to leave behind. If you've come this far with me, thank you. For listening, for staying, for letting these women be heard one more time. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it. Say their names aloud. Remember what was done in the quiet, so no one ever has to carry it alone again.